Are you there addressing yourself purely to technique in the cinema and exploring and almost cinematically having a kind of experimental fun, or is there any content meaning in a sequence like that?
To me, there is no much difference between content and form. I mean, you can reach content through forms, and you can reach forms through content. You need both, but you need a move from one to another. Only forms, then it becomes an advertising business, or only content is not good. Is not good either, because you miss. Because the human body is a form, and this form has a content like an envelope as a letter. Without the envelope, you can never send the letter.
Jean-Luc Godard has died at the age of 91 on the 13th of September 2022. It was an assisted suicide. Jean-Luc Godard was, in a way, a kind of poster boy for the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave movement that had started in the late 50s, actually just in 59 with Francois Truffaut's 400 Blows, and then the next year to be followed up by Breathless, which is considered to be a masterpiece of the cinema, in my opinion, a masterpiece of postmodernist cinema. I think in a lot of ways, Jean-Luc Godard and Breathless predate films like Pulp Fiction of Quentin Tarantino. In fact, there is a direct link that you can draw from the movie crazy madness of Quentin Tarantino all the way back to Jean-Luc Godard. An exact line, almost as if to say that Quentin Tarantino is a student of Godard.
I'm not really a big fan of Jean-Luc Godard anymore. I think Godard is like the way if you're like a young artist, or especially, I'm not talking about fine art, but more like, comic book kind of art or something. I think Godard is a little bit like a Frank Frazetta. You kind of like, you get into him for a while, and he's like your hero for a little bit, and you start drawing shit like him, and then you kind of outgrow him. I think that's kind of what Godard is for at least for me anyway, as a filmmaker. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I just think I've outgrown him. Godard was so influential to me at the beginning of my aesthetic as a director, of like wanting to be a director. His kind of like lack of complete any type of film style, just wanting to make movies for love of it. Godard is the one who taught me the fun and the freedom and the joy of breaking rules, setting up a close-up on the back of somebody's head as opposed to, and just fucking around with the entire medium, all right, and breaking rules. But I consider Godard to be to cinema what Bob Dylan was to music. I haven't grown out of Dylan, I've grown out of Godard, all right, and I'm not kicking the old guy, all right, it's just I've grown out of him now. While I say I've outgrown Godard, I haven't outgrown Pauline Kael's reviews of Godard. And the most influential piece of film criticism I've ever read of my aesthetic that applied to me, very young. I remember reading it at Philippe's, that French sandwich place. All right, I had one of Pauline Kael's books, and I'm reading her review of Band of Outsiders, also known as Band Apart, which I named my company after. She's reviewing Godard's movie, and she says, it's as if a couple of movie crazy young Frenchmen were in a coffee house, all right, and they've taken a banal American crime novel, and they're making a movie out of it based not on the novel, but on the poetry that they read between the lines. And when I read that, I was like, that's my aesthetic. That's what I want to do. That is what I want to achieve.
And I think Godard can be considered definitely not just one of the gods of cinema, but to consider an absolute maverick. The reason why I would call Godard a maverick is because of the kind of Nouvelle Vague, the kind of movie madness of French cinema that was going on with film critics turned filmmakers. In fact, Godard was quoted once saying that he felt that when he was a film critic, he was already a filmmaker, that a film critic is its own kind of filmmaker. And then when he became a filmmaker, he used the medium of film to criticize other films. And you can see this especially in a film like Breathless. And you can see a kind of you can see that carry through in a film like Content. And Godard not only used his powers and ingenuity as a filmmaker to criticize and critique other films, particularly American films, he used his powers to, how do you say, critique and go into other areas to give sort of these anthropological critiques of society as a whole. As a fact, Jean-Luc Godard was never a film student. Jean-Luc Godard was an anthropology student in university. And you can see that sense go out. You can see that feel in a film like Two or Three Things I Know About Her, which is a critique of, not a critique, but a critical analysis of society in 1967, of French society in 1977, particularly in that area. Even if we look at the postmodern kind of referentiality of a lot of Godard's films, his tendency, much like Quentin Tarantino, to reference other films in his own movie. What's interesting about Jean-Luc Godard's approach, in contrast to Quentin Tarantino's approach, is that Quentin Tarantino makes these references and draws these comparisons almost as a means of paying homage and to revel in kind of the glory of that time period that he's referencing. But there's also another aspect to Quentin Tarantino where he's kind of providing a different view of pop culture and movie culture. If you, for instance, look at a movie like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is not a film that I'm particularly a fan of, but if you look at a movie like that, the references that Quentin Tarantino makes are not references that are completely obvious to anybody who was alive during the 1960s and 70s. In fact, the movie goes so far as 1969, but makes references to films in 1970, 1974. He's making references to films and music and TV that nobody has ever heard of. Even if you grew up during that time that Quentin Tarantino is referencing, you've never heard of this music, never heard of these directors, like Antonio Margheriti. Like, you've never heard of these sort of cultural references, because what Tarantino is doing is making references that are personal to him, and he's providing this underground culture. So in a lot of ways, a Tarantino movie is a kind of like a view of the 60s, of the 70s, of that era, but through the looking glass, where the underground culture is on top and the mainstream top culture is at the bottom. Whereas with Jean-Luc Godard's use of references, I think, have more of a critical dimension to them. Jonathan Rosenbaum even said so himself, that Breathless is a kind of critical manifesto on behalf of American cinema. And I think that's really true, and you can see that in the references that he makes to Humphrey Bogart, Otto Preminger films, and so on, as well as self-referential kind of cares to cinema. Many of Godard's contemporaries, like Chabrol and Truffaut, became milder and milder as time went on, as they got older, as they matured as directors, as opposed to their sort of radical roots. Whereas Jean-Luc Godard became more and more interesting, more experimental, more radical, more, I almost want to say, esoteric. And the interesting thing about Godard is that he provided a new way to look at cinema. I think Godard, much like other directors like Antonioni, Orson Welles, John Ford, Griffith, they provide us with new ways to tell stories within the cinematic medium, and Jean-Luc Godard in particular changed the way that we can look at and analyze film and understand influences and breaking the rules in cinema, not necessarily keeping to the same kind of language and film grammar, understanding film grammar, but it's that understanding that he has which makes his breaking of the rules so inventive and interesting. It was difficult for me to really construct a way that I could tell this essay or construct this essay or write it, because I feel as though it's very difficult to sum up, I think, a man's life and his work in one kind of video essay. But I think, I think it's good to acknowledge Jean-Luc Godard as being a legend of the medium. What upsets me about the online movie community is that there's very little acknowledgement of Jean-Luc Godard's passing, and a lot of these big, these movie channels didn't really seem to cover it, or haven't really seemed to have noticed that Jean-Luc Godard had died. But then maybe that's me thinking too much into it. Monica Vitti died earlier this year, and no one, and not I didn't cover it. I didn't talk about it, even though I think I should have. But I think it's important to understand that Jean-Luc Godard's passing is a loss to the medium.
C'est vraiment dégueulasse.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle a dit?
Il a dit, vous êtes vraiment une dégueulasse.
Qu'est-ce que c'est dégueulasse?